Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Rav for giving up the time he has to prepare and to answer these questions for us. And with that, we'll get straight into the questions. Shimon Moshe Hecht asks, when is the shofar to be blown? Does this change if one is davening alone?
First of all, the Mishnah in Masechet Mechila, Perek Sheni, states, Kol Hayom kasher for many mitzvot, including Tekiyat Shofar. And at the end of that perek, it states, Kol Shemitzvato Bayom kasher Kol Hayom. Therefore, the shofar may be blown all day long, from sunrise until sunset. Having said that, there is a concept of zerizin makdimim lemitzvot. So one does not delay unnecessarily. The earlier that one can perform the mitzvah, the better. That briefly is the answer. If one is davening alone, then the best time, I suppose, or there doesn't have to be this way, is to blow the shofar after Tefillat Shacharit and before Tefillat Musaf. Definitely not to blow the shofar during the Tefillat Lahash, the silent Tefillah of Musaf. In the middle of that to blow, which is the minhag of certain communities. This is a very strange minhag which is to be avoided. So if one is davening alone between Shacharit and Musaf, but if for whatever reason one did not blow the shofar, at that point one can blow the shofar all day.
Thank you very much, Harav. Follow-up question from Shimon Hecht. How is the shofar to be blown? Specifically, which sounds and how many times each?
Well, everyone is familiar, I imagine, with the basic concepts of tekiah, shavarim, and teruah. And I will show you here, and this is in Sidur Rav Saadia Gaon on page Resh Yod Zayin 217. You can actually see, perhaps, I hope you can see, perhaps you can see a graphic depiction of those three sounds. The tekiah is a long line, and the shavarim is three separate sounds, blasts, and the teruah is one longer, continuous sound which wavers, which like a siren goes up and down. In fact, I intended to have a shofar here with me to actually demonstrate this, but I forgot it. So either way, tekiah, everyone I think is familiar with. It's a relatively long blast of the shofar. The shavarim is roughly the same length, but divided into three shorter blasts. The teruah, and here this is the important point to note. It is not, as most people are used to hearing it, and this is also how I was taught, as I recall, as a child in the Jewish school to which I went in Sydney as a boy. This was how it was drawn on the blackboard. The tekiah was one long line, just like Rav Saadia Gaon drew it for us also, and the shvarim was 3 dashes of medium length, and the teruah was 9 small dashes, 9 separate sounds. So it's boom, 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 boom. That's a teruah. And that's wonderful, except that it's wrong. Very few people know this. In fact, of all the Jewish groups or kehilot in the world today, essentially only the Temanim and Kehilat Torah Eretz Yisrael, I believe, I hope, are familiar with the correct teruah. The Temanim, as with many things, have maintained over the generations, an unbroken, accurate, authentic tradition, how this sounds, how it is done, and it is a one long wavering sound. So it's a woo sound like that, and it's roughly the same length as the tikiyah, or the three shivarim together. That is why Rav Saadia Gaon, when he depicts them, he uses precisely this you can see, one straight line, three shorter lines, and one long wavy line. That is how the sounds are supposed to sound, how they're supposed to be, how to produce them, and how they should sound. If you wish to ask how does one produce such a teruah sound, there are two ways that I have seen it done. The simple way, I believe, and this is what I do, it may not be the best way, but it's I think more straightforward, and it works for me very well. I hold the shofar as I do with the tikiyah, but I slightly move the shofar with my hand, very slightly, as I'm blowing as it were a tikiyah, and that movement of the shofar causes that wavy, undulating sound. I have discussed this with a number of temanim, including one person who was an excellent Baal Tokea, Baal Tikiyah in the Temani shul in Yerushalayim, where I used to daven for many years, and he said to me, "That's the easy way, but the real way is not so." He tried to explain it to me, and he did it this way. He showed. I mean, I saw him do it many times. He somehow produced that wavy sound from his stomach, from his lungs. In other words, it was from within him. He didn't move the shofar at all. The shofar didn't budge, but it came out that way. So it's something that he was producing within himself. And I tried. I was never successful in reproducing that methodology. My methodology, I think, is simpler, and it works. So that's what I do. What other question was asked here? How many sounds? How many sounds? Well, this is generally understood and agreed to by all. We do 3 sets of sounds. That is to say, tikiyah, shivarim, teruah, which ideally lechatchila should be done, according to a number of rishonim at least, in one breath. Tikiyah, shivarim, teruah, tikiyah, and that is repeated 3 times. That's one set. And then tikiyah, shivarim, teruah, tikiyah, tikiyah, shivarim, tikiyah, that's another set, which is repeated 3 times. And then tikiyah, teruah, tikiyah, also 3 times. So if you count the shivarim and the teruah as 2 sounds, then it ends up being 30 sounds altogether. That is what is required.
All right, thank you very much, Harav. Jonathan asks if the shofar for Rosh HaShana has to be from a ram's horn.
According to the Peshuta Shel Mishnah in Masechet Rosh HaShana, it says there in the Mishnah, Kol ha-shofarot kesherim hus mishal para. All shofarot of all animals are kasher except for that of a cow. In other words, goats, the shofar, the horn of a goat, or a deer, certain kinds, not the antlers of European style reindeers, etc. That doesn't work really either. But if you could make it work, it would be permissible. It has to be the kind where you have a hard outer shell and an inner softer section, which is then removed by boiling, etc. And then you end up just with the outer shell. And that such a shofar, such a horn, exists on a number of animals, mountain goats and sheep, and certain kinds of deer in Eretz Israel, etc. antelopes. But that's what the Mishnah states, and that's what many Rishonim also state, such as the Ramban. But in his famous drasha on Rosh HaShana, he discusses this at length, and he disagrees with the Rambam. However, Rav Sa'adia Gaon and the Rambam hold that it must be of an ayil, that is to say, a male sheep. And I'll read to you the lashon of Rav Sa'adia Gaon. He writes, "Shofar," the same page as I mentioned before, page Resh Yod Zayin in his Sidur. "Shofar she'anu toke'im bo," the shofar that we must use on Rosh HaShana, "lo yihye ela keren shel ayil." It must be only that of an ayil, a male sheep, a ram. وَأَصُولَ الشَّنَوْتَ ثُرَثُ, and its shape may not be changed from its natural twisted, somewhat spiral shape. When I was a child growing up in Chutz La'aretz, all the shofarot that I saw had been straightened out to some extent. In other words, they were basically a kind of, you could say an L or a resh shape. They were sort of straight and then they went up. But the natural twisted form of the shofar had been somehow worked out of it, because when it's heated, it becomes malleable and you can easily change its shape. But this is not right. Whether it's posel, if it was made straighter or not, that is something one could discuss. Rabbi Yosef Gafeh Zatzal was of the opinion that it was posel, as he explains also at length in his Pirush on the Rambam. I'm not convinced that it's posel, but I am convinced that it should be as it is in nature, as it's created by Hashem, as it is on the animal's head. We're not supposed to change the shape, just remove the inner part of it in order to create the hollow reality of the horn of the shofar, so that it produces a sound. And the Rambam, by the way, states exactly the same, and it's very possible, I would say perhaps even likely, that Rambam was influenced by Rav Sa'adia Gaon on this issue, as on quite a few issues, in fact. The son of Rambam, at the beginning of Ilchot Shofar, is shofar shetoke'im bo, the shofar that we use on Rosh HaShana, because he begins by saying, "Mitzvah aseh shel Torah lishmoa teruat shofar b'Rosh HaShana." It is a mitzvah to hear the shofar, the sound of the shofar on Rosh HaShana. And he says, "Shofar shetoke'im bo," the shofar that we use for this purpose, ben b'Rosh HaShana, ben b'Yovel. This is these mitzvot are connected. They're learned one from the other. Who karen hakavasim hakafuf. Rambam does stress the word kafuf. That is true, as Rav Sa'adia did. It is the horn of the ram, which is bent, twisted over. It's not straight. As opposed to what? As opposed, for example, the long antlers of certain antelopes, which the Temanim like to use these shofarot. They're very long, and they produce a much deeper, boomy sound. And they do have a spiral shape to them, but they're straight. In other words, they generally describe a straight line. They're not bent like that of a ram. So it's not kafuf, it's not bent over. It's straight, although it has a certain helix-like shape to it, like a DNA strand. But it all goes in one direction, as opposed to the keren hakivasima kafuf, the Rambam describes here, which is the bent over, twisted, and not straight ram's horn. And Rambam stresses, v'chol shofarot husmi keren hakeves, and all other horns, all other shofarot, except for this one of the ram, are pesulim, says Rambam. So obviously we therefore, even though the pshat of the Mishnah and the Sugya does not seem to be as Rav Sa'adia and Rambam state, and it's actually a very good question on what their position is based. It's not very clear, at least not to me. If someone has an idea, I can explain the Shita. I'm eager to hear it. But that's the fact of the matter. So it's obviously correct to use the shofar of an ayil of a ram, and that is what essentially all of Am Yisrael does.
Thank you very much. Joshua Friedman asks, may one eat before hearing the shofar on Rosh HaShana in circumstances where he has no choice but to attend a minyan that finishes after or close to chatzot?
I'll just mention, Leon, that it's difficult to hear you. So if you can do something about that, for those who will hear this recording, or even now live, it's difficult to follow you. But I understand that the question is that if one is in a situation, in a minyan, in a community where the shofar is going to be blown at a certain time, and in many places because of the length of the tefillah, particularly the Ashkenazi tefillah, this is essentially an Ashkenazi circumstance or reality, because the tefillah is long with many piyutim, etc. People get hungry, which is quite reasonable, and also it's one should not go beyond hasot, midday, without tasting something, so as not to be fasting. Therefore, they take a break and they make Kiddush and they eat something and they continue with shofar and musaf. Generally, Sfaradim and Teimanim, in my experience, do not do this. They don't need to. They have the tefillah is considerably shorter. At any rate, is it mutar? It is mutar where there is no choice. It's mutar to eat something, to taste something. Again, it is not correct to be fasting or to get to midday without having eaten anything, but not to eat a meal, not to have bread. Someone can have some other food stuff, something which is considered a achilat arai, a temporary meal, something, not a real meal.
Thank you very much, Rob. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, thank you. We have some questions now on the subject of Yom Kippur. May one wear comfortable non-leather footwear on Yom Kippurim?
It is definitely preferable not to do so, because the whole inyan, the mitzvah, is to be mit'aneh, to feel the lack of a certain thing on Yom Kippurim, whether it's food or drink or footwear. So if one is wearing, $800 sports shoe, whatever make it takes your fancy, and some of them are probably even more than that, and they're extremely comfortable, even though there may not be a scrap of leather in there, it's really not, it's defeating the purpose. Now, it goes without saying that in ancient times there was no such footwear that was comfortable and that people would choose to wear willingly and happily, that was not made of leather. The only kind of real shoe, the only kind of real footwear was leather footwear. But today there are many materials which are extremely comfortable and even durable, but not leather. So I do not think it is correct to wear a good, comfortable, non-leather shoe on Yom Kippurim. The same applies to Tisha B'Av as well. One should wear something which is distinctly not so comfortable. If one can wear some kind of a slipper, some kind of a simple, cheap kind of, what would they call them? The kind of thing that people might wear at the beach or near a swimming pool or something like that, something which is not, you're not actually barefoot, and therefore you may not feel the cold or the heat of the floor as you would if you were truly barefoot, but something which nevertheless you are fully aware of the fact that you're not wearing shoes. That should be what we're aiming for.
Thank you very much, Rob. Another question. Are moisturizers for dry skin permissible on Yom Kippurim?
No, not permissible, unless we're talking about some serious medical condition where the person's skin, shall we say, on his hands if he doesn't use this on Yom HaKippurim, then he would suffer. His hands, skin would crack and bleed and that sort of thing, and maybe get infected. Then it might be mutar, possibly, but otherwise, no. What would I suggest? That whatever one needs to usually smear on one's hands should be done just before the beginning of Yom Kippur, and that should be enough to get you through to the end of the day. For most people, most situations, I think that should be sufficient, because there is an isur of sicha, not siha, but sicha with a samach and a chaf, which means essentially anointing or like pouring or rubbing oil on your body or on your skin, which is what people used to do. When people had dry skin in those days, they would pour some olive oil on their hands and rub it into their hands. And then to this day, some people do that, and it works very well. And that's exactly something we're not allowed to do on Yom Kippurim. And the difference between a moisturizer and olive oil is not very great, not very significant. So basically, it should be avoided unless the situation is an extreme one.
Thank you very much, Harav. Levi Yitzchak asks, can one go to the mikveh for Yom Kippurim with earplugs?
Okay, this is a serious question. It's less serious for men than it is for women who have the same question sometimes with regards to a nida who has to go to the mikveh. So let us address the question not specifically or only with regards to Yom Kippurim, where anyhow the idea of going to the mikveh on Yom Kippurim is not a chova. It should be pointed out as a minhag. It's an interesting minhag. Rav Saadia Gaon writes explicitly in his Sidur that after having been tovel in the mikveh erev Yom Kippurim, which he does mention this practice, then he says that you come up and you make a bracha, asher kiddushan, etc., al hatavila. And some of the poskim were surprised that he would mention this. I don't find it very surprising, because I think his and others' shita was that a man, for example, is nowadays not required a piyadin to go to the mikveh, but if he does, then he should make the bracha. That was the shita. I think that was the shita of Eretz Yisrael. And this we see explicitly in Sidur of Saadia Gaon. And that is my practice. So I think when a man goes to the mikveh, whether it's Erev Yom Kippurim or any day of the year, having come out of the water, because in general I suggest making the bracha after the tevilah, that the bracha be made. With regards to earplugs, we have the concept of hasisa, of something which prevents the water of the mikveh coming into contact with all parts of the body. But there are various halachot and rules and principles with regards to this halacha. First of all, we have the concept of mi'ut she'eno makpid, something which covers or acts as a hasisa, something which prevents the water coming into contact with the part of your body, which covers only a small part of your body, not a majority of your body, and something that you're not makpid about, that you don't mind if it's there. In other words, it's not like, shall we say, some paint that's on you were painting the house and you got paint on your arm, on your leg, or wherever on your face, and you would not leave it there. You would want to remove it. So if you went into the mikveh with such paint or a tar, you were pouring tar on the roof, and some of it got stuck to your skin, then you would not want to leave it there. So you are makpid that it not be there. That's considered a hasisa. But if it's something that you would not be makpid, you would leave it there. You really couldn't care less if it's there or not. Then, and it's a mi'ut, then it's a mi'ut she'no makpid, and it's not considered a hasisa. So there are those who claim that with regards to an earplug, because it's not something you're makpid about, in fact, it's the opposite. You want it to be there because you need it to be there. For example, you have a perforated eardrum, or you're someone who, excuse me, someone who tends to get ear infections if water gets into the ear. Such a person is interested in that hasisa, in that thing being there. It's not the usual kind of material that is a hasisa with which we have no purpose for it, and it's there by chance. But here, this is very deliberately there. So there are those who claim that it's mutar even for a woman, even for a nida, to use earplugs when it's necessary, because it's a mi'ut and no makpid. There are those who disagree, who are not very comfortable with this idea, and therefore I recommend the following. This is what the Avnei Nezer, Hagaon Baal Avnei Nezer, wrote as follows: that it is mutar, and he was writing with regards to a woman, kal v'chomer for a man at Yom HaKippurim, to wet his or her fingers in the water of the mikveh, and then plug one's ears with one's fingers, and be tovel. In almost all cases, that will be sufficient to prevent any significant amount of water getting into the ear or onto the eardrum, and that should do the job. Because the Avnei Nezer explains that in that case, the water on the finger and which is also touching the inside of the ear, a very small amount, but there is some water. There's some reality of water there that is mahubar to the water of the mikveh, and it's not considered a hasisa. He's one of the greatest geonim of the last several generations. And that is my suggestion.
Thank you very much, Harav. We have a few questions from Ron. The first one is, how many meals is it a mitzvah to eat on Erev Yom HaKippurim? Is it better regardless to have more meals?
I believe there is a question which you skipped. This perhaps was added later. I see a question before me with regards to if one is not going to fast on Yom Kippur for medical reasons, should one recite Kiddush? The answer to that is no, one does not recite Kiddush on Yom Kippurim. If one is capable of saying the tefillah, shall we say, in the evening, the beginning of Yom Kippurim, there is a chova lekadesh et Shabbat and lekadesh et Yom Tov b'dibur, b'dvarim, with words, by speaking, by saying something about the fact that today is a special day, and one performs this mitzvah by reciting the tefillah, which mentions the special nature of the day. But Kiddush, no. With regards to the question of how many meals on Erev Yom HaKippurim, there is no specific number of meals. The idea is that one eat well on Erev Yom HaKippurim so that one will have the strength to fast and will not be harmed by the fast. If a person wants to eat 2 or 3 meals, whatever works for every person, to each his own, that's fine.
Thank you very much. A related question, when does the fast begin on Yom Kippurim? Is it better to bring in the fast earlier?
There is a hova according to everybody, according to all opinions, as opposed to Shabbat and Yom Tov, where there is a mahaloket on this point, whether one is required in a Torah to add mi'ahol ala kodesh. With regards to Yom Kippurim, there is no such mahloket. In other words, it is agreed to by all that on Yom Kippurim, before the beginning of the day, so in other words, at the end of the 9th of Tishrei, one already begins to, all the various isurim and the inuyim begin already from that point. What do I mean from that point? Not from sunset, but before sunset. How much before sunset? It does not state explicitly how much before, but it cannot be a minute or 2 minutes, which is too short a time. First of all, one has to be careful. We're talking about Yom Kippurim, so one has to cease all such activities that are asur in Yom Kippurim well before that time. So we're talking about at least 10 or 15 minutes before sunsets. One should refrain already from any of the activities which are asur. And obviously, this includes eating. Is there any inyan to bring it in earlier than that time, like an hour before, well, no, not really, no. But if one wants to, that's perfectly okay. But whether it's 1 hour before, or 30 minutes before, or 15 minutes before, does not make a difference. But one cannot cut it too fine.
Thank you very much, Harav. And a final question from Ron. Is there such thing as being allowed to drink an extremely tiny amount on Yom HaKippurim if one finds it very difficult to fast?
Absolutely not, unless we're talking about someone who is ill, significantly unwell, either because this person is really ill and has been instructed by competent doctors whom we trust. In other words, that we believe that they understand that this is a serious matter, and they claim this person really must either eat a small amount at least, or at least drink a small amount during the day of Yom HaKippurim. If that's the case, then yes, the person eats or drinks very small amounts. In the case of fluid, we're speaking about something like a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons of water at a time, and then waiting about 1 minute, and then, if necessary, doing that again. If, for example, a person fainted on Yom HaKippurim, we can revive him and make sure that he's okay by allowing him a sip of water and seeing if he's okay. If, of course, we see the person is not okay, and we are concerned that it's something life-threatening, then of course he has to be rushed to a hospital, or a doctor has to look at him, or what have you. But if a person says, I'm feeling unwell, I'm feeling weak, well, yes, a lot of people feel weak on Yom HaKippurim or Tisha B'Av. That's just the nature of the thing. Particularly perhaps older people, or people of weaker constitution, or people with certain medical conditions. If they're not life-threatening, not very serious, but yes, the person may feel very weak, well, they should sit down, maybe they should lie down. The person is very weak and tends to dehydrate very quickly and knows themselves, and if they have to remain lying on their bed all day Yom HaKippurim, that's what they should do, rather than drink anything at all. Drinking or eating is only in extremis, only in very clear circumstances which justify it.
Thank you very much. We have another question, 2 related questions from anonymous, someone anonymous, and Avraham May. Should one uphold the old minhag of fasting during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva? In general, should one keep up to optional fast days?
There's no simple answer to this question, because on the one hand, a ta'anith can be, and this is this was the intention of the minhag, a ta'anith can be an important tool in allowing a person to focus their attention on a given day on certain things, teshuvah, and related ideas and thoughts. And Aseret Yemei Teshuvah is obviously a good time for such a thing, on the one hand. On the other hand, a lot of people, I would say probably nowadays, the vast majority of people, find it difficult to do so, to go to work, to have to study. In yeshivot, on fast days, we see that people are not able to learn as they normally would. Whether it was so in ancient times or a few hundred years ago, it's difficult to say. Although there really are some ahronim who speak about the fact that certain fast days lead to bitul Torah and yeshivot, etc. So really, it's something that the individual must decide for themselves. If a person feels that this for them is the right thing, and it's productive and helpful, for their avodat Hashem during this time, or any time during the year for that matter, then there is definitely room for such a ta'anith. And one of the topics, one of the ideas, the concepts discussed in Masechet Ta'aniyot is exactly such a thing, ta'anith that the person takes upon themselves. So there is such a concept in the Torah. But it's also true that it seems that we're more pampered and less able to go about our business and fast as seems to have been the case many generations ago. So it's something that every person really should decide and weigh up well, and they can try. You can try one day, half a day, and see how it goes.
And a related question to this, there seems to be a movement against fasting, for example, within Brisk, because people are generally weaker today. But the fact that Arabs fast for over a month each year seems to counter this claim. As they were established by our great sages, is overturning these fasts a correct practice?
I don't know about a movement, but it is true that in the Brisk world, which is, it should be stated, is not a very large or significant segment of the Torah world, but there are certain communities, small numbers of people, relatively speaking, who hold by brisk shitot on various things. And yes, there is a tradition amongst some of the briskers that we avoid fasting, but mainly because of the concept of bitul Torah. That they found and they feel that it is better to tell people that they should eat and be able to learn, etc., rather than fast and end up not having the koach to do very much. Again, it depends on the person. I'm not sure it's a really decision for a community or for a yeshiva to make. I think it's a decision for the individual to make. As for what the Arabs do or do not do, well, there are all kinds of Arabs. There are Arabs who actually do fast. There are Arabs who pretend to fast. And there are Arabs who quite openly do not fast. And how they manage what they do, etc., well, that's really not my concern. We go by what we see before us, and again, I think it is something for the individual to decide. The fact that we see nowadays, as compared to the situation, shall we say, in the Middle Ages, where fasting during Aseret Yemei Teshuvah was a very common practice, and nowadays it's not a common practice at all. That's one fact that we see. Another fact that we observe is that it seems that many generations ago, Ta'anit Bechoroth, Erev Pesach, was something that people actually kept, people actually fasted. But nowadays, as the Rosh HaShana writes, that already 100 years ago he wrote this, that we have many generations, we have not seen or heard of anybody who actually fasts on this day. Everyone goes to a siyum, and that's the end of it. This seems to indicate that something has happened, something has changed. This is not a newfangled idea, as the Rosh HaShana points out. This has been going on for many generations already. The Ta'anit Bechoroth essentially doesn't exist in reality. It's something that is commemorated on paper but done away with in practice. Was it ever a chovah? No, probably it was never a chovah. It was always some kind of a minhag, which was probably only kept by some of Am Yisrael, not all of Am Yisrael. It's not a chovah, it seems, but the fact is, it was once actually kept as a fast day by at least a significant portion of the tzibur, and today this is not the case. So it does seem that something has happened. It doesn't strike me as just a light-headed, frivolous lack of care or piety on the part of the majority of people, that they just couldn't be bothered. I think it's something a bit more meaningful, something a bit more real than that. And again, I think that every person should honestly and sincerely examine the question, and a person knows his own capabilities and how he will react, and what he will do with himself on that day if he fasts. And a person can try and see what happens. If it doesn't work at all, it's very difficult, and it then perhaps there are better things to be done, such as taking on maybe even some kind of a nether to learn something on that day, something specific, to learn a masechet, to cover a perek of Mishnah on that day, to learn 3 prakim of Tanakh on that day, to be more makpid about something like that, or to give a certain amount of tzedakah, etc.
All right, thank you very much, Rob. We now have a few questions about Shvi'it. Joshua Friedman asks, should every person make a pruzbul, even if he doesn't expect to need it?
Some people suggest that all people do a pruzbul. I'm not convinced of the need or the wisdom of such a path. I myself do not think it's necessary with regards to banks and things of that nature, for various reasons. I don't want to go into that at length now, but I don't think it's necessary for that reason. If a person knows that he loaned a person money and he would like to be repaid, then he should definitely do a pruzbul. And it's easy enough to find the form, and there are certain organizations and batei din that to do this, and they're also sort of pretty ad hoc kinds of arrangements where this is done frequently on Erev Rosh HaShana by many people. If one does expect to use it, want to need it, then it's definitely a good idea, and one should do it. On the other hand, of course, if a person gave a loan to someone who was in need of a loan, because this person right at that time was in a difficult situation, and that person may still be in a difficult situation, and you really, to be honest, can manage reasonably well, even if you're never paid, you're never repaid for that loan, then I think it's quite praiseworthy just to forgive the loan, if you think that person was a worthy recipient, and you were doing the mitzvah of tzedakah by helping that person out at that time. You don't have to demand that loan be repaid. This doesn't apply to someone who asked you for a loan of $30,000 to buy a new car because he just happened to be his liquidity at that moment was low, but in 2 weeks' time he'll have that money and he'll repay you. That's not a needy person, so that's a different situation altogether. But if it was given to a person who was in need, and it's an amount that you can forego, then I think there is something to be said for that. And if not, then do the pruzbul.
Thank you very much, Rob. The next question was, is it preferable to forgive a debt? Is writing a pruzbul equally acceptable? But I think that was already covered.
Yes.
So we have some assorted questions now. The first one is from Shimshon. Is Elul an opportune time to repent?
Well, the opportune time to repent is always, excuse me, and all of us should always consider ourselves to be ba'alei teshuvah, who have done teshuvah, who are trying to do teshuvah, who will need to do teshuvah. really, a Jew is always trying to do teshuvah, in the sense that he's always trying to improve himself and examine his deeds and think about what he does, what he doesn't do. This is why Rav Kook Zitzal suggested that a person, at the end of each day, write a kind of a diary or a notebook to himself about what he did that day and what he thinks maybe he should have done differently. By writing these things down, one can actually hope that one will remember and take more notice of these things and maybe actually do something about it. So teshuvah is always correct, always good. In other words, examining ourselves and critically and objectively as much as we are able to do. Elul, because it leads up to Rosh HaShana, is even more so, even more opportune and more relevant a time for this, and the most relevant time for teshuvah and for self-examination and changing our ways, improving our behavior and our ways and our attitudes, is Aseret Yemei Teshuvah. That's why they're called Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, for that reason. And that's why Rav said to Rabbi Hiyah that during this time you should be more makpid about certain things. In other words, those days are particularly relevant days for Teshuvah, more than the whole month of Elul. And the same is true for selichot. The original minhag of selichot, no, without doubt, was between Rosh HaShana and Yom HaKippurim. And then it was extended in the various communities a bit beyond that. So amongst the Ashkenazim, they began roughly a week before. And in some communities, which is the minhag of the Sfaradim today, for a whole month before. But the ikar really was Aseret Yemei Teshuvah. And that's the most important time. But one does not have to leave it till after Rosh HaShana. Before Rosh HaShana is also a very good idea, without a doubt. The Meiri, Rabbeinu Shlomo, the Beth Meir, writes in his Hibura Teshuvah that the Chachamim specifically stressed and wanted people to focus on matters to do with Teshuvah before, during, and after Rosh HaShana.
Thank you very much, Harav. We have two related questions from an anonymous questioner. The Rav has said that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael should really celebrate only one day of Rosh HaShana. Is the Rav therefore recommending that we wear tefillin on the second day?
First of all, we are discussing Jews who reside, Baruch Hashem, in Eretz Yisrael. Yes, it is true that I believe that Rosh HaShana in Eretz Yisrael should be one day and not 2 days, as it is practiced by almost everybody nowadays. Not everyone is aware of the fact that this was not always the case. We find both in Sefer HaHilukim, which is an ancient text going back to apparently the end of the second half of the 7th century, the minyan. It records many of the differences in halachic practice and custom between the Jews in Eretz Yisrael at that time and the Jews of Bavel. And there it states explicitly that in Eretz Yisrael they keep all the Hagim, all the Yamim Tovim for one day. This includes Rosh HaShana. And there are other well-known statements to this effect. Rav Nisim Gaon, 1,000 years ago approximately, wrote to Rav Hai Gaon in a teshuvah, which we have in more than one manuscript, which was also printed already some generations ago, and more recently in another more accurate version of that teshuvah was reprinted, another version, another book, and it's already quoted. The essence of that teshuvah is quoted by Rabbeinu Zerachia Halevi, the Bala Maor, Masechet Beisa. Rav Nisim Gaon from Kairouan, North Africa, Tunisia, wrote to Rabbi Gaon in Bavel, asking him, why do you claim, Lama Adonenu Omer, why does our master claim that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael should be keeping Rosh HaShana for 2 days, when we see with our own eyes that they're keeping it for 1 day? There is no clearer possible testimony than that statement, which is several centuries after the Sefer HaChilukim that I just mentioned. And it seems, therefore, for the entire interim, that was the case. Probably also before Sefer HaChilukim and also after the question was asked. And this is why the Rif, I think it's clear to anyone who has a feel for these things, why the Rif goes out of his way to stress that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael should keep 2 days of Rosh HaShana, because he knows that's not what is actually happening. And he was following the opinion of Rabbi Gaon, as he usually does. But the reality on the ground was not so. And it was changed, apparently, seems to me, in the first decades of the 12th century minyan. That's apparently when this historic changeover took place, which is after the first crusade, which was 1095-96 minyan, which was a tremendous blow to the Jewish communities of Eretz Yisrael. Many Jews were killed, many fled the country. So essentially there were almost no Jews left in the country after the first crusade in the subsequent years for some time. And at that time, if, as it seems to have happened, some important rabbanim from Provence, from the south of France, came to Eretz Yisrael and insist that everyone follow the Rif's ruling, it seems to me that was the likeliest time when they would be able to succeed. I think it could not have happened in any other historical situation, that the Jews of Eretz Yisrael would simply have said, "Oh, okay, if that's what you want, we'll do that." We're talking about something, seems to me, probably 7 centuries or more of fixed practice of 1 day. Such things do not change very likely, or are not usually changed at all. If such thing happened, which it did, it must have been because at that particular time, the few Jews left in the country were really unable to resist this sort of steamroller attitude of these big rabbanim who came, and there was no one really to argue with them, and they could essentially enforce their will. That's, I think, what happened, which is also not really, I don't think, the way halachic debate should be conducted. But that's what happened. But then again, not everything that happens means that it should have happened, but it did. So yes, I think it should be 1 day, and I do think that on the second day, I would recommend to everybody, the Maaseh, to at least put on tefillin. I wouldn't suggest going to shul where no one else is doing it and causing a mahloket. I'm not suggesting that for a moment. Lo yishaneh adam mipanei hamahlokot, as the Mishnah states in Pesachim. But to do so b'sin'ah, privately, I think is to me makes sense. Makes more than sense. That is what I would recommend. Yes.
And the follow-up question to that is, if one is to observe only 1 day of Rosh HaShana, may one recite Kiddush for family members who wish to observe 2 days?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. We're talking about reciting. Oh, I'm sorry, I misread it. It's not Kaddish, but Kiddush. Oh, I see. Okay, now I understand the question. I think it is mutar to do so, even if one thinks that it shouldn't really be Rosh HaShana today. I think it is mutar to make Kiddush for those who think it should be, or who would like to continue with that practice. Yesh al mi lismoch. We have Rabbi Gaon, we have the Rif, we have the Rambam, the Rosh, who say that it definitely should be 2 days. This is also the minhag ha'olam. So I don't think that one has to necessarily refrain from making Kiddush for family members who wish to observe 2 days.
Thank you very much, Harav. We've got to the 1 hour mark. Is the Rav able to continue?
let us see how it goes.
Thank you very much. We have another anonymous question. If, for medical reasons, one cannot remain standing for the whole length of Shacharit and Musaf on Rosh HaShana and Yom HaKippurim, what are the most appropriate parts where one can sit down?
Essentially, the issue is as follows. Min hadin, old people, unless they're very old or ill, not well, all people should stand for all of chazarat hashatz, for all of the tefillah b'sibur. And I know that that's not what most people do all year round, even when chazarat hashatz is just a few minutes long, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minutes long. But that's what should be done. That's clear. It does not say anywhere in the Shulchan Aruch, for example. Someone once said to me that, but that's not true. It says in the Shulchan Aruch you can sit down. I said, please show me where it says this in the Shulchan Aruch. It doesn't say any such thing. It's true, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't actually state explicitly that you have to stand. It doesn't say you should sit either. It doesn't say that you may sit. The Rambam says explicitly you must stand. And the Orchot Hayim says the same. In fact, he says even more emphatically that when during chazarat hashatz, every individual who is present is actually davening a second tefillah at that moment. So obviously you should be standing. The difficulty is that, and particularly again, according to the minhagim of the Ashkenazim, with a very long chazarat hashatz and Rosh HaShana and Yom HaKippurim, mainly even more Rosh HaShana, that it's very difficult to remain standing for many people for such a length of time. So really, the reality is such that it's machshil. It causes people to do something they should not be doing, but it's also difficult to demand that they stand. So at least if one cannot stand the whole time, then one should be standing, I think, at least for the actual sections of the chazarat hashatz, which are actually the tefillah that Chazal were metaken, as opposed to the piyutim. For the piyutim, I think you, if necessary, sit. But for the tefillah itself, which is the ikar, then if possible, one should be standing.
Thank you very much, Harav. We have a question from Pinchas ben Susan. How many days selichot should be said? As
we mentioned before, the original minhag clearly was from Rosh HaShana till Yom Kippur. And then it was slowly in different communities expanded to one extent or another. Selichot is a minhag, it's not a chova. And it goes by minhag hamakom, whatever is your community is doing, your shul does, that's what you should be doing, basically. I am fully aware of the fact that again, I think the Ashkenazim are at quite a disadvantage when it comes to selichot as compared to the Sfaradim, shall we say, or the Temanim. The Sfaradim recite selichot for 40 days, but every day is the same. They're reciting the same texts day in, day out for 40 days, year in, year out. So they become familiar, they become used to them, they know them very well. And you begin to know them almost by heart, and there are tunes which there are chants and tunes and there's a certain interchange between the shliach zibur and the kahal. So there's a system. So over the years, if you go to a Sfaradi or Temani shul where they say selichot, there's a system, and everyone understands how the system works, and everyone knows the texts, and you can see, I see that the Sfaradim are much more enthused by the selichot than what I see in Ashkenazi shuls. In Ashkenazi shuls, every day of the selichot, the texts are different. The piyutim, the selichot are different. First of all, the language is much more complex, difficult to understand. For most people, many people, the language is not obvious. It's not obvious in what it means. Even if you are Hebrew, or you understand most tefillot most of the time, here it's some of these piyutim were written by all of them were written by very special people, and you see this in the style of the language. It's sometimes such highbrow, such complex, involved, brilliant command of the language, and references to Pesukim and a Midrash and all sorts of things that are all woven together in a beautiful, artistic, creative way. So that they're truly works of art, but most people don't know what's happening, don't know what's being said. And that's why for many, many years now already, perhaps at least a generation or two, there have been selichot with, again, Ashkenazi selichot particularly, with a perush, with a translation, with a perush, so you understand what's going on. But the fact that it's every day something different means that you cannot get used to it, and you don't remember from year to year. And there's no well-known tried and tested tune that everyone's used to and everyone knows how to join in. So many Ashkenazim, I think, during Selichot are basically lost and also therefore not enthused at all, and not really able to get into it because they barely know what page they're on, and if they do know what page they're on, they don't know what it says exactly. So it's there's a problem here. I think the whole system has to be re-examined. The system of the Sfaradim, of Temanim, of having much more fixed texts which everyone knows and repeats many days, and therefore there's a system, there's a rhythm, it's an experience which you learn, which you repeat, and you become very used to. It seems to me works and achieves the purpose much more successfully.
Thank you very much, Rav. We have a question from Gabby. What does the Rav think about including the part about the Asara Haruge Malhut and the davening on Yom HaKippurim?
It's an ancient minhag, and there's nothing wrong with it at all. If it does, and I'm sure it does in many cases, in many communities where people understand what's being said, it causes people to consider the terrible events described there about great Chachamim, Hasidim being captured, tortured, executed by Rish'ei Umot HaOlam. This is something that is calculated to bring people to tears, to become emotional, and le'orer anashim leteshuvah, cause people to consider life in general and their own lives, what they do and how they do things, and what's important and what's less important. If it serves that purpose, it's a very powerful thing, and there's nothing wrong with it at all. In fact, it's very positive.
Thank you very much. We have an anonymous question. There's a widespread custom to blow the shofar at the end of davening during the month of Elul. Does the Rav feel that it is preferable to stay longer for the purpose of hearing the shofar?
I'm not sure how much longer one has to remain in shul to hear the shofar. If one is staying for everything else, then the shofar is just another few seconds. It seems to me the question that needs to be asked is a different question. Are all the many additions that are recited at the end of tefillah on a daily basis, are they really necessary or even desirable? That's a more serious question. And I will explain. Most people have to get up in the morning at a fairly early hour, and they have to go someplace. They have to get to work, they have to go to a yeshiva, they have to go to a university, they have to go to school, whatever it is, they have to do something. And they have to be there by a certain time. That's how the world works. And most people have a certain number of minutes in the morning that they can set aside for the purpose of tefillah. I would say for many people, it's something like 30 minutes, 40 minutes at the most. Whatever you tell those people to do, to say, to recite in those 30 or 40 minutes, they will. because that's what the Rav said you have to do, they'll say it. But the number of minutes they have at their disposal is not going to change. It's going to be 30 minutes. So if they have to read from page 1 to page 133 in those 30 minutes, that's what they'll do. That may mean that they'll have to rush through and mumble things and not really pay much attention to much of what's going on. Well, that's the price, but that's what they will do. And if you tell them, well, actually, you don't need to do that. You need to go from page 1 to page 70, and everything else is really, after that point, is only if you have time, or you do it in your own time, and in your own way, then they'll spend those same 30 minutes covering less ground, and then they'll probably, hopefully, be able to have a much more positive and meaningful and significant experience of tefillah. So, if you look in the Rambam, you look in other sources, it says that, after Uvadas Sion in the morning, you say Kaddish, and that's it, everyone goes. But nowadays, if you have Arleno and Shir Shel Yom and Pitum HaKetoret and there's a Kaddish after everything, and maybe something else, and on certain days this perek of Tehillim, and on other days another perek of Tehillim, well, you've just added 10 minutes, shall we say? That's significant for many people. So that I think is the question that should be asked, not so much the shofar. The idea of the shofar, of course, is to remind people that Rosh HaShana is approaching, and that's good. That's important.
Thank you very much. We have a series of very related questions from Yonatan Roland. What are the simanim on Rosh HaShana? Are they to be eaten by night or day? Are they to be eaten before Hamotzi or after? And should the siman of apples and honey be replaced with dates and date honey?
One could give a shiur of at least 2 hours on this subject, and probably not cover everything that needs to be said. Basically, the original statement, first of all, this is a statement which appears in the Talmud Bavli. It does not appear, for example, in the Talmud Yerushalmi. It's the kind of thing that you might expect would appear in the Talmud Bavli and not in Yerushalmi, speaking about the segula, the mystical, allegorical significance of certain foods, etc. But even then, the original statement of the Talmud was not referring to eating anything at all. It was referring to having them on the table and seeing them. You didn't have to eat them. If you want to, you can, but you don't have to. It's not a question of eating. Eating is not the main thing. The main thing was to have these things before you, present, because they're symbolic of something. And the Talmud Bavli believes a lot in symbolism of this kind. You will note, by the way, that the Rambam doesn't mention, for example, the Rambam doesn't mention such a thing. It doesn't exist. If you look in the Mishneh Torah, it doesn't tell you that you're supposed to eat anything in particular or look at anything particular on Rosh HaShana. At any rate, the simanim can be many things, as is mentioned in the Talmud. This is mentioned in the Torah. I think it's Tal Kof Pei Gimel. Yes, it speaks about the Torah quotes Etroga, Kara, Ruvia, Karte, Silka, Tamre, Ruvia. In other words, an etrog, which most people don't know about eating bichlal, if you can eat an etrog, which you can. Kara is pumpkin, and Karte is leek. In other words, it's a kind of onion, really, part of the onion family. Tamre is dates. All of these things are fine. There are other things mentioned in the Torah here. The Torah speaks about Rosh Keves, and the Torah mentions the minhag of apple and honey, which was an Ashkenazi minhag, because these are things that were available in Europe. There's nothing wrong with apples and bee honey. If you prefer dates and date honey, that's fine. Whatever works for you. Another question is when to eat it. As I said, you don't have to eat anything, but if you want to, that's wonderful. Is it nice? Is it a nice minhag? Yes, there's something nice and special and festive about it, and the children are usually hear a lot about it in the kindergarten, in school, so they're looking forward to it, and there's something special. So it's kind of said there, like on Pesach almost. It's a very nice thing, but when to do it, that's entirely up to you. In my experience, if we start eating these simanim, either before or even after, and we'll see the beginning of the meal, often people have little appetite left for the main meal that's supposed to still yet to arrive. And therefore my preference and my suggestion, therefore, is simply based on my experience. It's not a halakha, it's just, it seems to me common sense, to do these things as a dessert. You don't have to eat at the beginning of the meal. You can, if you want to, start with the meal with some honey, that's fine, no problem, or anything else. But if you do these things at the end of the meal as a dessert, a kind of formalized dessert course where you have dates and you have Ashkenazim make tzimis, which is, a sweet carrot dish with honey, and you can have your apple and honey at that point, and you can have etrog, anything that you like, rimonim, whatever. These are all very appropriate foodstuffs for dessert. That would be my recommendation. And that way, the children and everybody else will actually eat the real meal itself, and you'll be able to keep them up for the exciting thing to come at the end. Bit like Lela said there, when you're supposed to keep them awake by various ruses. So this is a kind of ruse to keep them awake, perhaps.
Thank you very much, Harav. We have a question from someone anonymous and also from Yonatan. Are tashlich and kapparot authentic Torah practices? If not, may we adopt them regardless?
Kapparot, first of all. Yes, it is true there are quite a few sources. The Torah quotes sources from the Geonim, and we know this was the case. And to this day, there are many people who perform this minhag of kapparot, on the one hand. On the other hand, in Siman Tau Resh Hey, if you look in the Tur and the Beth Yosef, the Beth Yosef, first of all, brings the source for what the Tur quotes, the minhag of Nishchot Tarnechol leChappara, of using a chicken and slaughtering it, etc. And there's a certain ceremony where they say certain words and psukim. He quotes from the Mordechai and the Rosh. They quote this minhag. That's true. And then he quotes a teshuvah of the Rashba. And the Rashba says, yes, I've heard about this teshuvah. This is to be found in Chelik Aleph, in Shuta Rashba Siman Shin Sadi Aleph. He says, yes, I'm familiar with this minhag. I've heard about it, particularly people in Ashkenaz perform this minhag. He says at the end of his tshuva, Im kol ze, nevertheless, manati haminhag hazeh me'ireno. In my city of Barcelona, I prevented people from doing this minhag. In other words, in his time at least, he didn't allow it to take place. In those days, people actually listened to someone like the Rashba. So if he said to the people, Jews in Barcelona, don't do it, they didn't do it, apparently. So one assumes. So he says, Manati haminhag hazeh me'ireno. I prevented this minhag from taking root in our city, and he didn't approve of it at all. And the Beit Yosef quotes from the Orchot Hayim, who quotes in the name of the Ramban, that this minhag is asur mishum darchei ha'emori. That's basically a kind of sorcery, or akin to witchcraft or something like that, and is asur. And that's what the Shulchan Aruch himself writes explicitly in the Shulchan Aruch, in that Siman Tau Resh He. He says, so I have it before me here. Just a moment. The Shulchan Aruch writes, Machon Noharim la'asot kapparot be'erav Yom HaKippurim, lishhot tanurol, al kol ben zechar v'lomar alav pesukim. This minhag of kapparot with the chicken and the pesukim, etc. Yesh limnoa haminhag. This minhag should not be allowed to take place. It should be people in charge, if they can, they should prevent it from happening. The Rama immediately adds that there are Gaonim who approved of this minhag, and this is what goes on in our country, in our part of the world. That's true, but the Shulchan Aruch didn't like this minhag at all. It goes without saying the Rambam would have been of the same opinion. I think there's a lot to be said again about this minhag of kapparot. Two things can be said. On the one hand, Jews, like most other people perhaps, certainly in days gone by, were just as susceptible to and inclined to believe in various types of witchcraft or strange esoteric practices which smack of sorcery or witchcraft or divining or what have you. There's no question that this was going on in the Jewish world as it was in the non-Jewish world. And it shouldn't even surprise us that this is the case. And if certain things were commonly practiced by the Gentile population amongst whom the Jews lived, over time, clearly they would be influenced and pick up various practices. This is not new. It happened. It happens today. It happened 1,000 years ago, and it was going on in Bavel, particularly in Bavel, but not only in Bavel, in the time of the Talmud, as we see in many things related in the Talmud. In later generations, even though in the Talmud Yerushalmi you will not find any mention of, essentially of shedim, of demons, but in the post-Talmudic period, we have found, archaeologically speaking, we have found all kinds of amulets and things, Kemein, written by Jews in Eretz Yisrael in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, even later. Jews were susceptible to these things as much as anybody else. The question is the Torah educating us to eschew such things? And the answer is yes. So I believe. So the Rashba believes. So the Ramban believe, and the Rambam, and the Shulchan Aruch in this case. That's one thing to note. The other thing to note is that to this day, nevertheless, there are Jews who perform this minhag, and they do not want to relinquish it. And to my mind, this tells us something else that we should be aware of, and that is that some Jews certainly, want korbanot. This is essentially a kind of korban. Jews want a korban. Some Jews feel that without a korban, they're not really able to achieve mechila, and it's lacking. There's no mikdash, there's no korban. So we'll make something up. We'll do something to replace that which is missing. That's really what's going on here, and not just now. That's what's been going on for many generations. That's what's happening here. There are many people within Am Yisrael who want a korban. There are also, I know, Jews who do not want korbanot. I'm aware of that as well, but there are certainly Jews who do. And those who like the concept of kapparot, they would love the concept of korbanot. And maybe some of them haven't even made the connection in their minds between these two. They may think they're disparate concepts, but they're not. They're the same thing, essentially. I mean, all the sources that talk about kapparot speak about this is, zeh temurat zeh, this is instead of me. It's just like a korban hatat. That's what it is, basically. But I personally recommend quite forcefully not to get involved in such practices at all. That's with regards to kapparot. With regards to tashlich, all of the above is true, but even more so. The Shulchan Aruch never heard of, even the Shulchan Aruch never heard of tashlich, apparently. This is clearly an Ashkenazi minhag, which is very late, perhaps 100 or 150 years apparently before the Ramah at the most. The Ramah talks about it, yes, but it was unknown in other parts of the world. And if you look at this minhag, you understand it has to be a very European Ashkenazi minhag. And where it came from exactly, well, I have learned articles about it here in my library, which I've looked at. going back years ago, and they describe the ancient sources where these ideas originate. But basically, and no one who keeps the practice of tashlich, which I haven't done since, I don't know, since I was in my maybe early 20s, I haven't performed this practice of tashlich. But people who do it do not understand at all what they're doing. The original minhag of tashlich was to go, first of all, to a river or to a lake or some body of water where you have fish. This is explicitly mentioned in some of the sources, classic Ashkenazi sources. Talking about, it has to be a place where you have live fish. Now, why would you care if you have fish or not? And then you read in other sources that Jews used to go and carry breadcrumbs with them, little balls of bread they would prepare. And they would even do this on Shabbat, when Rosh HaShana fell on Shabbat. And that's why some Posukim Achronim talk about this. How is it mutar to carry these breadcrumbs to the river? Well, it's not, but that's what they're doing because this is more important than Shabbat, obviously. So you go to the river and you throw these breadcrumbs into the river to feed the fish. Now, why? And most people perhaps don't know this, but that's the original minhag. Now, why are you doing this? The ancient folk and the sort of magical concept and the esoteric concept involved here is that the water is the abode of the Satan. The Satan lives in the depths of the water, and the fish are his minions. They're his messengers, and really the breadcrumbs are a kind of korban. You feed the fish, and that's basically like feeding the Satan. You're giving him something, so he'll leave you alone. That's the essence of the minhag. That's where it comes from. Most people don't know this, don't understand this. They don't know why they're doing it. But that's the bottom line. That's the essence of this minhag. It's a very European minhag because think about it logically for a moment. Where are you likely to find a river or a large body of water in Eretz Yisrael around Rosh HaShana time when it hasn't rained for 6 or 7 months? Where are you supposed to find a body of water? Every Jew in Eretz Yisrael lives next to such a river or such a place. If you happen to live next to the Kinneret, maybe, or right next to a certain part of the Yarden or the Dan, what have you, maybe you're lucky enough. But otherwise, no chance at all. There's no such thing. But in Europe, there are lots of rivers and lakes and waterways and streams with fish. No lack thereof. And that's why it's obviously a very European minhag, which could not possibly have grown up in Eretz Yisrael, or in Bavel for that matter. And it's a very late minhag, but the essence of it is precisely what I just described. This has been written by scholarly articles, and it's very obvious when you look into it. That's what's going on. So it's a very pagan and therefore very improper minhag. I recommend very without any hesitation to have nothing to do with such a minhag, to drop it, to forget about it altogether. It is many, many times more important and useful and helpful and productive to study a pasuk in the Tanakh, or to learn a Mishnah, a halakha, the Mishnah, or to read a halakha, the Rambam, or anything at all, rather than go looking, especially if you live in Yerushalayim or Eretz Yisrael, go looking for some body of water. I remember, for example, when I was Talmid in Yeshivat Merkaz Harav, where exactly in Shchunat Kiryat Moshe in Yerushalayim, on Rosh HaShana, you're going to find a body of water anywhere in Yerushalayim. So what did people do in the neighborhood? There was some old well or cistern of water from generations ago that still existed in someone's backyard. And at the bottom of this large hole, which had a cover over all of the year, some kind of metal iron cover, which was locked during the year. They opened it up on Rosh HaShana, and at the bottom there was possibly an inch or two of some very murky and unsavory-looking water. Certainly no fish, and no water to speak of either. And that's people standing around this board, around this ancient cistern or whatever it was, when water was not so readily available, probably from generations ago when people first began living there and there was no steady water supply. And people would stand around this thing and say tashlich. You look at the original sources talking about rivers and lakes with fish, and think about this, and you understand how ludicrous it is. But of course, some people will not want to give it up, and that's just how it is.
Thank you very much, Harav. We have another anonymous question. May one take a nap on the afternoon of Rosh HaShana and Yom HaKippurim?
Make this one simple. Yes, one may, particularly if one got up early to daven very early, etc. One most certainly may do so, yes.
Thank you, and we have a few extra questions about Sukkot here. Chaim Ginsberg asks, what should one do regarding buying in etrog this year with regards to Shemitah considerations?
Because there is Kiddushas Shvi'it in etrog, as opposed to a lulav, which according to most shittot, there is no Kiddushas Shvi'it with regards to a lulav. So therefore, one can either buy a etrog from some kind of osar beth din arrangement, where the people who grow these trees and look after them, etc., are employed by the beth din. They have an agreement. They're paid a certain amount for their work and their effort and their time and their shipping, and that's mutar. Another possibility is to buy the etrog b'havla'a im ha'lulav. In other words, you purchase from this person, say lulav, and he gives you an etrog as well. You tell him, I'm paying you X amount for lulav, and the etrog is not mentioned explicitly. That's called buying it b'havla'a, without discussing it explicitly. It's implicit that he's giving you the etrog as well, but you're officially paying for the lulav. You can also buy an etrog that was grown by non-Jews or land that belongs to non-Jews. Those are basically the options, and there's usually no great difficulty in finding one of these solutions.
Thank you very much. We have the last question from Joshua Friedman, who asks, should congregants say Yom HaKippurim Yisrael in addition to Halul Hashem, as the Mishnah Berurah recommends? This is assuming Hallel is being said in the conventional way, not as the Rambam describes it.
Yes, understood. Yes, I think that is preferable to recite Yom Yisrael, but in fact, I think it's preferable that when Hallel is not being recited in the manner described by Hazal explicitly in Masechet Sukkah, as quoted by the Rambam, who was quite emphatic that this is the way that it was supposed to be done, and this is how it should be done. In any other situation, I think that every person should recite every single word of the Hallel himself. So, with regards to Yom Yisrael and everything else, the answer is yes.
Thank you very much, Harav. We've reached the end of these questions. And once again, we want to thank you for giving up your time to prepare and to answer these questions for all of us.
Hizku v'yames levavchem kol ha'mehalim l'Adonai. I wish you all Shana Tova, Kethiva v'Hathima Tova, Shenitbaser Basaroth Tovot, Yeshuot v'Nehamot. Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.